provide some motivation to the conflicts in your world by adding hatred and prejudice. Welcome to my channel. I focus on tabletop role-playing games, video games, and science fiction. J.R.R. Tolkien created Lord of the Rings and all the fantasy around that, and particularly in Lord of the Rings, you talk about the Orcs and the Cherokee, and if I pronounce that correctly, and the way there was a hatred between them and the elves, and there was animosity between the elves and the dwarves and all of this, and so there was a lot of that in the original fiction, in the written books, and you don't see as much of that in the movies. They put too much, in my opinion, too much comic appeal between the elves and the dwarves, which wasn't in the books. But you always had the hatred between the orcs and the elves, and it was a constant motivation. And whenever I think of that, what reminds me of that, there's a song that was put out many years ago. Many of you may not have ever heard of it. It's called Indian Reservation. It was put by Paul Revere and the Raiders, and they did the song. And the song has some interesting lines. And they didn't actually write the song. It's early if you go looking it up. I'll put a link to a copy of it on YouTube. It says, "They took the whole Cherokee nation and put us on this reservation. They took away our way of life, the tomahawk and the bowie knife. And they took away our native tongue, and they taught their English to our young. And all the beads we made by hand are nowadays made in Japan. Cherokee people, Cherokee tribe, so proud to live, so proud to die." Now, if you think about the orcs, particularly the description that's somewhat in Tolkien, the orcs, either they were created possibly by elves. There's some discussion about that in Tolkien, that they were tortured and perverted from the elves, but they were driven away from the elven lands, so that they were put on basically a reservation, and whatever way of life they did was they changed. And if you're playing in Dungeons and Dragons, you can really see an oppressed nation. You could take the orcs and make them oppressed. They're driven away, that their traditional weapons are looked down upon, that they weren't there, and they common is their dreaded tongue that they have to speak to speak to those people who've oppressed them. This would add a much deeper relationship between the orcs and the humans and the elves and the dwarves, and would add interesting complexion to your campaign. And you think about how the Indian or Native American culture has been portrayed throughout, or actually throughout history, as how the impact it has had. I don't know if you've ever saw the movie Patriot, where Mel Gibson, I won't say the greatest film, but you see him with the tomahawk, and you start to appreciate how terrible of a weapon that really was. In fact, that today many of the special forces, they buy there are what are military tomahawks, and if you go taking a look, they're a very effective weapon. They have some very specific uses, particularly in hand-to-hand combat. They really are much better than a knife, and they have some real interesting capabilities. And that goes back to World War II. And if any of you have seen the Band of Brothers, where you saw the Easy Company, some of them shaved their heads into mohawks to jump into Germany, and they were the group that ended up at the Eagle's Nest in Bavaria in Germany, where they actually captured the Eagles, which was the Hitler's private, shall we say, resort, or where all the generals were and things like that. If you haven't read the Band of Brothers, which is another wonderful book that's there, but you see how the idea of the American Indians started to be terrifying to, or at least the Americans were presenting themselves that way because they were terrifying to certain aspects of the German military, because they were considered so wild and that they would scalp and kill people and so on. So there was a mythology built around that, and you can put that into your world, but to do that you have to introduce basically hatred and prejudice, because you're afraid of these kind of people because they are terrible. They eat babies. I mean, orcs, they eat babies. I mean, you can add that into your world and add much more color. You can add the things that go on. You've seen this throughout history where various groups have portrayed the other group terribly. And for me, where I've done like the World of Tiglath, where I wanted major conflict, I wanted it either at the start of a war, during the war, or after the war. So you've got these conflicts, and it's the various groups have preconceived notions. There's prejudice about them, and often it's racial, because you see that. We see that with the Japanese. We put the Japanese in internment camps in the United States because we were so concerned after Pearl Harbor. And let's be honest, after Pearl Harbor was a major wake-up call to the United States. And our reactions to that probably were not the best, but you can understand that there was prejudice and things like that. And then another movie which I didn't care for, but I'll mention, it's an interesting story called Windtalkers, where they used the Native American languages because they had no equal, that they're so different from Indo-European or even the Japanese or the other language families. If you've ever taken any courses on linguistics, I always enjoyed those. They were always talking about the weird differences between languages. But that fits into how you can color your world. You can add additional color and strength by having groups that hate each other. And that can be based upon racial prejudice, because that's the most common that in world history, not just American history, but in world history, there's always been racial prejudice throughout history. And so, pardon me, my throat's a little dry. But you can put that into your campaign for added color, for explanations why people act that way. Now, people get so concerned about, oh, are you adding various, I want to be in such a, quote, safe space. That's fine if that's the way you want to game, but if you want to add additional depth to your campaign, you need to think about that. Are the orcs, they don't fit well with anything else, the orc or the half orc or whatever? Is there animosity between them and the elves? Is there animosity between them and the dwarves? Or hobgoblins or kobolds? Whatever you play, does everybody get along nice? That's really sort of insipid, shall we say. You don't have the color where people dislike each other based upon their racial attributes. And in Dungeons and Dragons, do kobolds get along with elves? Do hobgoblins, which are goblinoid, do they get along with dwarves? And you've got orcs. How do orcs get along with kobolds? Because you can play all these characters and everything is, oh, sweetness and light. And then we throw a tiefling in there, and how are the reactions? Is there racial prejudice in your world? Or is just everybody accepting of everything? I just find that a little bit nonsensical, because it doesn't fit with reality that you normally run into. We don't like the ugly in that. Take a look at the movie or the book I haven't read the book. I've seen some of the movies. The Hunchback of Notre Dame, where the character who, quote, has a heart of gold but is misshapen. Now, I grew up and I remember there was a man who was hunchback. He ran a service station around the corner and we'd stop by it. And it was really quite bad. This is many years ago. I'm old. Well, I'm an old guy anymore. And when I was a little boy, I remember seeing that, and I remember asking my mother about that. And he was born, and his back was a full, you know, it was really, he was bent over completely. And he was a hunchback, the classic hunchback that was there, and that was a birth defect that he was born with. But people are shunned. And you can understand why people were shunned, because they had certain deformities. People hide their deformities and so on. But that one was one that you couldn't. But you ran into seeing someone who was like that, and you sort of feel sorry for them because they've got this deformity, but you have to respect them as a person. Now, I admit that you should respect them as a person, but in your game, that doesn't mean, particularly your non-player characters, can't have prejudice. The classic one in Star Wars, people they walk into the bar and we don't serve their kind, talking about the robots. And so your party walks into the bar and they go, we don't serve their kind. I don't serve the kobold. Or as I had in one of my last adventures I was running, the party walks in and they said, what do you want? And they said, do you want kobold wine? Kobold wine is, what they did is they took a very large glass container, stuffed a kobold, it actually made the jar around the kobold. There are ways to do that with the glass blowing and such. And so you actually put the kobold inside the large glass jar, and then you fill it full of the grape juice or the fruit juice, and let the kobold cause the bacteria to ferment it. By the way, there was the one about seagull wine. If you want to look up one of the more disgusting things, that's what they do, is they stuff a seagull into something and then they fill it full of something that will ferment, and it's seagull wine. Yes, that actually is a thing that does exist. And so I created kobold wine. But if you created that and you were a kobold walking into the bar, and there you see one of your kind that was used to cause the fermentation of some liquid, you would have some difficulty with that. So you can add these things to your campaign and add a deeper, more flavorful. Let's put it that way, using the analogy of flavors. If all you have is sweet and bland, I like pickles. I like the bitterness and the the acidic taste that you run into pickles. I like the contrast that they add to sandwiches, and the same thing with mustard and ketchup and salsa. They all add additional tastes to what you're eating. So add additional tastes to your campaign by adding hatred. People who dislike each other because of their clan, because of where they come from. Add hatred. Have two great houses fighting each other. You look at Game of Thrones. What makes Game of Thrones so interesting? You have characters, and you have the Lannisters and the Starks, and you have all these fighting between them because they're different kinds of people. There's hatred there. And what happens is that adds interesting complexities to your world. So I always have this problem with just people who, it's just everyone gets along. Can't we all get along? Which is fine in real world. You sort of would like that in the real world, but it doesn't make for a very interesting adventure. I mean, what kind of book is it if you pick up a story to read and oh, there's no problems. This is what that goes back to to Moore's book, A Utopia. How do you handle, how is that interesting? Things like that. So you want to add conflict, add problems, and add hatred and prejudice to your campaigns because they make them much more interesting. What's your opinion of that? Do you think I'm way off base? I know I'm treading out into the deep water by saying, let's make hatred and prejudice part of your campaigns, because some people go, oh, it's outside my safe space. Yes, I admit that. But then I've been known to tread out into this area before. So have you been in campaigns where hatred and prejudice were part of the structure of the world? I'd like to hear your comments. Thank you for watching my video. I look forward to learning what you think about this video. Let me know in the comments below. I appreciate all your comments. If you like the video, give it a thumbs up. If you don't like the video, give me a thumbs down. I appreciate both forms of feedback. If you're new here and would like to subscribe, you can click on the icon on the left. If you're interested, there's more content on the right.